Please welcome Knight Foundation trustee Martin Barron and Miami Herald investigative reporter Julie K. Brown.
Julie, great to be with you. This should be a great conversation. And first, I just want to thank you for the extraordinary work you've done on the Epstein case.
Thank you.
It really has been a true public service. So, and it's a real honor to be able to chat with you about it. So why don't we start in the present day? Okay, so there are millions of documents that have now been released that weren't available when you wrote your first series.
Right.
What I'd like to know is, what are the most consequential things that have emerged most recently from that mountain of documents?
Well, we were able to see how many people I think that Jeffrey Epstein had in his orbit, very powerful people, wealthy people, that he was able to manipulate. And he did it through money and through sex and through just being able to connect them. He was a person that tried to connect people together. But the whole purpose of it was to enrich himself. And we are starting to see that some of those people, especially prominent people, they were hoping to also enrich themselves. So if nothing else, we may not see evidence of a crime, but we're seeing a picture of how he operated and how many people just basically, fell under his spell, for lack of a better way of saying it. And it's surprising because some of the emails are using language, that you would never expect that person to use, and just doing things that you would never expect someone like that to do, some powerful person, head of a company, a CEO. So we're learning more about that part of it. Now, the downside is a lot of these documents are redacted, heavily redacted. So you can't make a whole lot of conclusions because of all those redactions.
Yeah, so it is remarkable. I mean, the language that these supposedly prominent people are making, they sound like teenagers.
Yeah, right.
And are there some that surprised you? I mean, more than others?
Well, I think everybody was pretty surprised by Bill Gates, and how he was involved and allegedly got, a sexually transmitted disease that he was concerned about. So I think that surprised a lot of people.
The sexually transmitted disease, or just that he was speaking the way that he did?
Probably both. But this is now a worldwide story. There are journalists that are calling me from every country imaginable. And what's happening is these documents are all online and anybody can access them. So everybody, just regular grandmoms, are looking at these files and they're seeing what I've known for quite a long time, just how widespread this was and who was involved, the prime ministers and the ambassadors and sultans, and just how many people really were involved. Now, we're not saying that they necessarily committed a crime, but there seems to be a pattern, that you could follow, if the DOJ wanted to really make a case. I think against some of these powerful people, they could.
Do you think they will?
No, not under the Trump administration. I don't think they will. They're protecting a lot of them. It's only us finding out, either from data people that know how to just get through the redactions, or, the Democrats are requesting some of these, I'll pick out something that sounds very, incriminating. It's all redacted, and then I'll ask them, can you find out? So it's sort of a backdoor way to try to figure out what happened.
Which individuals might make the strongest cases for an independent Department of Justice?
Which individual?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. So millions more documents are likely to be released, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
I don't know about that. They have said, the DOJ has said, Todd Blanche, it's interesting that they sort of put Todd Blanche in the slot of answering questions about this, and Bondi Pam Bondi, our former Florida Attorney General, had been sort of set aside until yesterday when she, appeared before Congress. But Todd Blanche has said that they weren't going to release anymore. But I don't think the victims are going to stand for it. I mean, the huge thing that happened out of this story that I did years ago, I had a hard time getting 4 women to talk to me on the record for that story. And I knew that there were at least 100. And so, fast forward to the current time, they are a whole force. They have bonded. Epstein didn't like when the girls socialized. He tried to keep them apart because I guess he didn't want this to happen and start talking to each other and find out that you're being sexually abused just like me, and that would have snowballed. But that's what's happening right now. These victims are really forcing the public and Congress and the Justice Department to be more transparent and to get to the heart of why Epstein was able to commit these crimes over, almost 20 years.
Right. What would you likely be looking for if there were many more documents to be released?
Well, I would like to know, because my series concerned the first failure that happened here in Florida with the U.S. Attorney Alex Acosta, and his team of prosecutors let him off with this lenient plea deal. And when you really think about it, had they done due diligence and done their job, we wouldn't be sitting here right now. So I'm looking at some of those communications and how Epstein influenced them. And apart from that, I am also saying Epstein really tried to get everybody in his pocket. Former prosecutors, police chief was offered a job, didn't take it. So you could see in these emails all the people that he's trying to manipulate or hire or pay money to. So I'm looking at if we could piece that together.
So that has been one of the enduring questions: is why did Alex Acosta let him off Epstein off so leniently?
Yeah.
What do you think? What was the reason? I mean, was it political corruption? Was it a sort of unwarranted deference to wealthy and powerful individuals? Was it campaign donations? Was it some systemic problem of sort of misunderstanding the nature of sex trafficking, thinking that, all these women, they're just prostitutes? You make reference to that in your book, for example. What was the reason? I
think it's a little bit of all of that, but I think overriding the whole thing is he was ambitious and wanted to become, as I understand it, a Supreme Court justice. And one of the things that Epstein was adept at is every single lawyer he hired for his defense team had a tie to one of the prosecutors. Like they used to work in the office with that prosecutor. One of them actually had a romantic relationship with one of the prosecutors. So Epstein hired Kenneth Starr and Jay Lefkowitz, who were with a very powerful law firm, Kirkland and Ellis.
Yeah.
And those are the kind of people that can make and break a career. And I think once those kind of names were, on Epstein's side of the table, I think he kind of weighed what his future was going to look like if he continued to prosecute this.
Interesting. So with all these documents that are out, everybody's been looking through these documents, particularly with regard to Donald Trump, but also to Bill Clinton. So what can you say at this point about what do they know about Epstein's personal behavior, about his sex trafficking, and what can we say about their own, whether they participated in any way in all of this activity?
Well, there is no evidence that I have seen that either one of them committed any crime. So I haven't seen it yet. It might be there, but I haven't seen it yet. But there's this question of what did they know, and sort of ignore. I can tell you that when Epstein was out and about, he had his little entourage of young girls all the time. And from what the victims have told me, they were ordered to sort of stand and not talk to anybody in the room. So imagine, that's kind of odd, you know, that they're like soldiers standing around him. So it would be very hard for someone not to look at that and say, this is really, really wrong. I mean, I think, you know, a lot of these powerful people had to know.
Including Trump.
Yeah, well, I just
Clinton.
broke the story this week about him telling the Palm Beach police chief, you know, after Epstein was arrested, he called him and said, thank God you're stopping him. Everybody knew what he was doing.
Right.
So, you know, and Trump was friends with him, you know, for a long time. So I think he knew, you know, whether we can prove it.
I mean, the Trump team is saying, well, that's evidence that he kind of told authorities that there was something wrong there, that he was doing the right thing.
He was trying to tip them off.
What do you make of that?
I think he was trying to get ahead of the story, personally, because he had plenty of time to tell the police when they were working the case.
Right.
And they waited until they arrested him before he
So how many years would have been passed in between?
Yeah.
Quite a few, right?
Yeah.
So there's so many more media outlets right now that are covering this story than when you were working on it essentially alone back for your series in 2018. And I'm wondering, where, if anywhere, do you think that some of that reporting, those stories have gone off the rails?
Well, you know, as I mentioned earlier, this is, you know, a story that you can get in on to these files, and, you know, if you really don't understand the story, you can make something out of nothing, you know. There are tons of people out there billing themselves as journalists who really don't know what they're doing and reporting things that aren't accurate. And this story has sort of attracted a lot of conspiracy theorists and wannabe journalists, and you know, in fact that helped Trump get elected because, you know, as if you recall, he had this whole momentum going, like we need to release the records, and all his people, his MAGA influencers, were saying, you know, elect Trump because he's going to open up these files and we'll finally see the client list, so to speak, and we'll finally know who was involved.
Right. Are there any particular stories that have struck you as like, well, that's just crazy that people are focusing on that?
I avoid the crazies. So,
good idea.
Yeah, I could spend all day on social media correcting wrong information, but I figure it's better to write my own story rather than.
So old-fashioned of you, my gosh. What do you know? We hear about all these other new things. Wow, actually verifying the information. That's great. It's so refreshing. Congratulations. So going back to 2018, when you launched on this series, I wonder if you can take us back to those early days, because it's not like Epstein hadn't been written about before. You know, in your book that there had been, as you put it, countless journalists had really looked at this story. But you obviously decided, well, I need to go back and look at this again and maybe in more depth. So take us through your thinking at that time. It's like, why did you do that? What was your reasoning for doing that?
Well, I was sort of one of those people that feels like when you have a mystery, I sort of feel like I can solve this mystery. And this was like a mystery because he had gotten such a lenient plea deal, and then we knew that there were, you know, hundreds of girls that he had molested. So to me, the question had never been answered. How did that happen? And the stories that had been written were a little bit more tabloid, sensational about the Lolita Express, his island, the celebrities, but no one, in my view, had really examined the criminal justice system and how that, you know, failed, essentially. So I felt, especially at the time, and I didn't know this was going to happen, but at the time I started looking at it, Alex Acosta got nominated by Trump as his labor secretary. And the Labor Department is a department that oversees human trafficking. And I thought, you know, at the time I thought, I wonder what these girls, women now, because it had been a lot of time, I wonder what they think about this man who let their predator off the hook, now being in charge of an agency with oversight of human trafficking. And that's sort of where it started with Alex Acosta and the criminal justice system that I thought needed to be better analyzed for how it had broken down.
Mm-hmm. Because a lot of times in newsrooms, I've experienced this myself, is that you talk about a story and everybody says, people say, we've already done that story.
Well, this happened.
You must have heard that yourself.
No, it did happen. It did happen, and there was, there was some, backlash because they felt like, why are you doing this? Because we already know about this story, or you're not going to find anything. And if you tell me you're not going to find something, then I always find something.
I'll never tell you that. I'll never tell you that. So I mean, basically, you were looking at you thought you would look at it a systemic failure, really,
right.
And that sometimes people aren't looking at that when they're covering the day-to-day story, right?
And also, I thought because time had elapsed, I actually had a debate with my editor, Casey Frank, on this because I wanted to put a sentence in there that there's something about. This is a case that time has not made right. Because sometimes with the passage of time, things, you uncover things and you understand them better. And I thought that there was a chance that maybe my work would make people understand it better.
Right. Case is a great editor.
Yeah.
But you argued with him about that phrase.
Yeah.
You said, I don't understand what you're saying here.
Yeah,
and
right.
you said, I insist that it be in there.
Yeah, right.
So I can't imagine arguments with editors. So actually, speaking of that, you were looking for a new angle, and I'm interested in how you talked to your editor, talked to Casey to persuade him that you should be spending your time on that. I suspect that he had a long list of stories that he wanted you to do, and there are enormous demands on someone who was doing the kind of work that you were doing.
Right.
So how did you talk to him and persuade him? I think a lot of people here would like to know how to talk to their editors.
I'm pretty persuasive, and
what does that mean?
It means, I think to some degree he thought, I'm just going to let her work on this for a while, and then he kept giving me more stories. So, at the time I was uncovering a lot of corruption in Florida prisons, and the stories were really important stories about inmates that were being killed, basically, in the Florida prison system. So he wanted to, he was really the editor behind that series. He wanted to continue. So he would just give me another prison story, and I could kind of shove it aside and keep working on it. And the Me Too movement exploded in the middle of all this. And then it was kind of funny because he said, where's that story? We want that story now. Because, it was now, in the current, people were talking about that, the Olympic gymnasts who had been abused by their doctor, and, all those stories sort of happened in the middle of this.
Right. Sort of we too need a Me Too story.
Yeah, right.
Okay. It's interesting because, I read through your book in preparation for this interview, and in the introduction, you pointedly note that when you embarked on this story, you were being interviewed for a job at the Washington Post to be on the rapid response investigative team, and then I was among those who interviewed you, and then you described your incredible deep disappointment at not getting that job at the Washington Post, mentioning for one of the many times you mentioned about your low pay at the Miami Herald.
Right.
So, I'm curious as to whether you should thank me for not hiring you, or whether I should be apologizing to you for not hiring. Which one is the correct thing?
I remember when I did that package to try to get that job, and I put everything into that package. I thought, this is just such a great package, and if they don't hire me, then it just wasn't meant to be. And that's it. Given what we know now about this case, I think that I was supposed to do this story, and I don't know if I would have been able to as a newcomer, because one of the reasons why I was able to convince Casey to let me do it is because, I was established. He knew I was going to try to find something. He saw that if anybody was going to be able to do it, it was me. By the way, I tell a lot of young journalists that I could never have done this story early in my career. This story was very, very big and very complicated, and everything that I did in my career, from working, in the obituary section to, just the cops, the courts, everything that I did, I think, prepared me for the reporting that I needed to do for this story.
Right. So I know you're not going to thank me for not hiring you, but you're welcome. So there you go. Anyway, I guess I should apologize, actually. So here you go. Finally an apology. Finally an apology. I do it in front of all these people.
Yeah.
So tell us how you got started on this story. I mean, it's a difficult story. You just talked about how you couldn't have done it, but talk about how you got underway. I know that you've written that you said you wanted to start from scratch. Tell us what that means, because I think there could be a real lesson in that for other people.
Right. Well, I thought the only way that I was going to be able to write with authority on this subject, first of all, there were a lot of lawyers attached to this story. Alan Dershowitz, Kenneth Starr, people that are going to go after you. So the first thing I actually did was go to our executive editor at the time, Mindy Gonzalez, and I said, I'm doing this story. There's a lot of, really big people, and it could be corruption among some, people in public office, and I guess I just want to make sure that you're prepared, because, it's one of those stories that lawyers would come after you and sue you. And she said, go for it. And so I knew that the only way my goal was to make it bulletproof. And I thought the only way I'm going to do that is if I know everything about the story in my head myself, because you just can't take a shortcut with a story like that. So I requested all the police reports. I had to read. There were a lot of lawsuits that were key actually to my story, because the victims in the years after he got his plea deal sued the federal government, and there was actually the lawsuit was 8 years, that lawsuit, and was still open at the time I started my series, but there was a lot of discovery. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of, exhibits, and, I tried to just, when you write about a lawsuit, you sort of you read the complaint, you try to pick certain elements. I had to read everything, because I quickly found out that, I just would not understand the story unless I really read every single thing in every lawsuit. And the other thing I noticed was that the police chief, who was, the Palm Beach Police Department, was the original department that investigated it. Neither he nor the lead detective of the case had ever spoken publicly. So I had to talk them into talking to me. And then, of course, I had to try to get the victims to talk to me.
Yeah, talk about that. Talk about trying to get the victims to talk, because women who've been victimized by people like Jeffrey Epstein, it can be difficult. So talk about how you made that approach and how that went.
Well, I didn't, as I mentioned, I didn't think that this story had ever been covered from that point of view, from the victim's point of view. So once I started, it took me a while to find out who they were, because they were minors and all their names were redacted from the files. So, like I said, a little bit of shoe leather reporting and really searching, I was able to get a list together. And the first time I went to one of the victims' home, I knocked on the door, and it looked like her father answered the door. And I thought, what do I tell him? Why are you here? And I sort of got away from that, and I thought, I got to figure out an approach on this, because I can't just, some of these women never told anybody that it happened. Right. So I ended up writing old-fashioned letters, and writing to as many of them I could find. And I only got one response from sending out about 100 letters, but she was one of the victims in my story. And then two of the victims I got from their lawyers because they had lawsuits. And the thing that I think convinced them to talk is Epstein was still out there abusing. We can see that from the files now. He was out there still abusing girls and young women. And I was taking an approach that they always wanted to be a part of. In other words, they were angry, they were frustrated, and they wanted to say the system screwed us over. And that was sort of the story that I had already seen from the research that I did that I was going to tell. And they were very, in fact, after they talked to me, a couple of them were like, I feel so much better that I was able to finally say how the system failed me. So it was, it was a victim-centered approach. And the way that also the other thing that helped me was I actually talked to people who either were in law enforcement and dealt with cases of sexual abuse of children. And I spoke with a psychologist. I sort of prepared myself a little bit because I didn't want to re-traumatize them.
Right.
And so they were really helpful and key to, I think, my approach to the story, because I understood, what their buttons would be, what their triggers would be. And, and I told them right away, you don't have to tell me, what he did to you. What I really need you to talk about is how the system mistreated you. So it was much easier to get into the story that way for them.
Is there something that journalists could have done or should have done to break the Epstein story even before he first came under official investigation? I think you made a reference, for example, in your book to a Vanity Fair profile by Vicki Ward, which started to dig some stuff up.
Right.
Is that something that you think people should have been more attuned to at the
Yes,
time?
I think just like the prosecutors early in this case were sort of rebuffing the police chief and lead detective's effort to arrest Epstein and to charge him with a serious crime, I think they reflected to some degree the way, our system thought of these girls, because they had taken money and, kept going back, and a lot of people don't understand that these girls were young and they were groomed by him. And it was, a pattern, and he was a master at it. And so I think that, the media didn't really understand victims. Not many people in the media understood victims and how sex trafficking and grooming works. So I do think that back then the media was doing the same thing. In other words, they were saying, this isn't really much of a story. It was a bunch of girls and they got money, they're prostitutes, And
you think that's why you mentioned in the book, for example, that some of your sources had been in touch with other media trying to get them interested in the story.
Right.
But nobody had actually pursued it. And do you think that's the reason that they didn't jump on the story?
Well, I know, for example, that a couple of the lawyers who were handling this case for a very long time and had discovered so much about Epstein and his trafficking. They were seeing from the evidence that they were collecting in discovery that this was huge, and that he had recruiters and scouts all over the world getting girls and women for him. And so this was part of their lawsuits, though. So I think, for example, David Boies, a famous lawyer, went to the New York Times and said to them, look at what we found, this is huge. And David told me later, they said, well, we'll wait until you settle the lawsuit and then we'll write about it. So I don't think they connected all the dots. And to be fair, it took me a bit to connect all the dots.
Right. Librarians and researchers were really important to you on this story, and I wondered, I totally agree, incredibly unheralded individuals in newsrooms, who work behind the scenes, and somehow are able to find an extraordinary amount of information that
Yeah.
we wouldn't be able to
I know.
find. I wonder if you could just talk about that, because I think that it's important to maybe pay homage to people who don't get a lot of attention in our
Yeah. Well, we had and unfortunately, a lot of these people no longer exist in newsrooms, including ours. At the time, we had a researcher named Monica Leal, and if you do still have one in your newsroom, or you should just really suck up to them, man. You know, I really liked her anyway, but I mean, I treated her like, you know, she was gold, because, you know, there were so many times she came through for me, especially if something happened late at night and I couldn't get into whatever database I was trying to get into, and she was always there like that. And they're sort of, I think some of them are they are journalists in a way, because getting this information, knowing what to look for, is journalism. So, you know, I think that they are, you know, also, you know, the unsung heroes, and also they're dying out, you know, this research, you know, aspect of our business, which is a shame, because it hurts journalism when you don't have people who can research and fact check and do all those kinds of things that are important.
One last question, because we've run out of time, but at one point in your book, you actually suggest that maybe you were able to get farther on this story because some of the sources thought, oh, well, this is just, I think you put it, a little reporter from a local newspaper who was writing a story that no one would read. That's how you put it.
Yeah.
Maybe talk about that. I mean, the capacity of local reporters to do stories of enormous national and international consequence.
Yeah, well, the Miami Herald has always punched above its weight. And so we had a good reputation for those kinds of stories. But, you know, when you're talking about, you know, Jeffrey Epstein getting a call from the New York Times saying, we're doing a story about your sex trafficking, he would have mobilized, you know, I'm sure. But I think first of all, he always believed he was above the law. And second of all, I just think that he just, like I said, I think he discounted it, because again, so many people had written about it over the years. He's still free, he's living his best life. And so in his mind, I think he thought he had pretty much gotten away with it.
Well, congratulations on all that you accomplished.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
Thank you.